Okay, good morning, Dad.
Morning.
Today is Friday, December 20th. And let's start with did you listen to Putin's speech?
No, I didn't. I read a lot about it. So I know what the main points that he hit, kind of the highlights of the speech, but I didn't listen to his speech. No, I just
Okay,
didn't
yeah,
read it.
it was like a 4 hour plus long marathon,
Yeah,
from what
right.
I
It's
understand.
incredible.
Well, what just from what you've heard and read other people say about it, what are your main takeaways, or what do you think are the main takeaways from that speech?
Well, I think, for especially the things that we're concerned about, and that's really the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and by extension, Russia and NATO, that he seems to be very confident. He doesn't, there isn't any signs of frustration or anger or whatever, which you see in Zelensky's speeches all the time now. He's insulting people left and right.
Right. Actually, hold on,
And
just say I should clarify. This isn't a speech; it's actually a Q and A, right?
yeah, right,
It's end of year Q and A. Yeah.
right, right,
But
right, right. And also he showed, as far as I could tell from everything I've heard about it, that he didn't give any kind of indication that the Russians were prepared to make any kind of significant compromises. That he laid out what they required back in June in a speech that he gave to the Foreign Ministry board, I think it was called, and and since then they have repeated. He himself has repeated those conditions, and so has Lavrov and Peskov and other high-ranking Russian officials. And in this recent speech, again, he didn't make any. You'd really have to, I think, twist a word or really apply some kind of spin pretty intensively to find any sort of indication that he's backing away from that.
is there any reaction from the West? Any acknowledgement that this is the reality, or
No, it's amazing how actually there's so little attention is given to what Putin says. But Putin is consistent in his thought, and if you listen to him, you know what he's going to do. Uh, you know, um, but yeah, very very little attention is given to what he says in general. I guess, I wonder if it's just like we're so used to slimy politicians who just, um, make promises they know they're not going to keep, and, based on focus groups and, marketing of different kinds. And so we just assume that it's all phony. Maybe it's, we become so cynical because of our own politicians and we don't pay attention to them. But you can see, for example, people that really should be paying attention, like Kellogg, the appointed representative, the peace representative that's going to be sent to Moscow, I think, immediately after the inauguration. He seems to just believe what he sees on CNN or Fox News. The Russia and Trump does too. The Russian economy is in terrible shape. It's on the verge of collapse. The Russians are losing huge numbers of men. They're depending on the North Koreans and all this nonsense. Um,
wait? So you think that people like General Kellogg, or what about Trump himself? Do you think these guys aren't actually even listening to Putin's speeches or the words that he says? They're just still getting all that information
it
from
certainly
Fox News
appears
and
to.
CNN?
I know it's incredible, but that seems to be the truth. Unless it's some sort of elaborate charade, and I don't think it is. Trump's not that kind of person, and
That seems.
I
But I mean, if you're a businessman, I mean, and you're going to want to negotiate a deal, surely you have to do your due diligence, right?
right.
Anytime, that's just common sense. You have to. How do you, if you want to negotiate a peace settlement, you don't think that Trump or General Kellogg are even listening to what the other side is saying straight from Putin? The guy's telling you exactly
Yeah,
what he's
right.
saying, and you think they just don't hear
I
it?
don't see any signs of it. It's just like if you listen to them and you say these people are getting their news, from their information from Fox News, or if if they are being advised, like, if there's some sort of representative of the intelligence agencies that are giving them reports, this person's spinning it so that it conforms to the, the narrative that is adhered to on Fox News and other news sources, mainstream news sources.
I guess it's possible because when you're in that high level position, you're used to always being debriefed. You're like, I'm too busy. There's too many things.
Right.
Somebody give it to me in a condensed
they're
form.
Not going to sit down
it.
and watch the press conference for 4 hours. They're just not going to do that. Yeah, and then you kind of
should though. If they
they probably should. This is the thing that I used to think that like if I became president, I would learn all these secrets. I'd really know what's going on. I think that actually sometimes the president is one of the least informed people because he's the most powerful man in the country. Everybody wants to have his ear and wants to bend his will to their favorite policy, right? So he's kind of like right at the center of a big spin machine. And he's not hearing what the truth is. If he was really suspicious, he would make an effort to find somebody who's really honest with him. And he could do it. I think that there are honest people in the intelligence agencies, but they just generally don't rise to the top. They've learned, the people that run these agencies they're political animals, and they know it's important to just tell the boss what he wants to hear and, what fits with everything else that he's hearing. And, if the only thing we could hope for is that Trump actually, explodes in rage when he finds out that, hey, you've been just lying, get somebody in here who's going to tell me how it really is. And that could happen. But I just wouldn't put a whole lot of hope in that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Trump being in the middle of the spin machine, so it could be hard to kind of get real information if
I think, again,
everybody's throwing things at you.
Right. Again, I think that's really maybe what the main benefit of the so-called negotiations or dialogue could be. Like you were saying yesterday, educational. It's just that they've been told, don't listen to, he's the Russians say these things, but they don't mean it. They're on the verge of collapse. They're looking for an off-ramp. And, we'll start to, apply some pressure, some carrots and sticks, and they'll do what we want. I think that's the way. It's clear that that's actually what Trump is thinking. And then, and Kellogg seems to believe that very much himself. So he goes there and he's just thinking confidently, look, hey, yeah, we know you guys are in trouble. We'll give you an off-ramp. You got to, concede this. And, hey, we'll give you a little something here and maybe some sanctions relief. And they'll find out the Russians are just laugh in their face, and he'll go back to Trump, maybe try it again and finally realize, hey, maybe the Russians are really very serious about this. And I think maybe we got to begin to start, thinking about adjusting our policy. That's the best thing I think you can hope from the dialogue that hopefully will be established.
I can understand maybe somebody like Trump, who's not a military man, that's in the spin machine, everybody's talking to him. Okay, I understand. But if Trump chooses General Kellogg as the special envoy, it's like, this is your job. Your mission is to, communicate and start engaging diplomacy with the Russians and the Ukrainians. You think that General Kellogg, as a military man, first of all, he should know this to begin with. He's in the military. He's a general. Right. And then he's been assigned this very, very important task. It's like he should be preparing for the test of his life. He should be going over all of Putin's speeches, all of his notes, everything that's happened. That's his job. How is it that he is oblivious? It's like, we're just going to roll in there and tell the Russians what's what. To me, that's insane. That doesn't make sense.
Yeah, well, it's also just grossly irresponsible, it seems to me. But, all I offer as way of an explanation is that these generals, U.S. generals, tend to be very political animals, and they rise to the top because, again, they know they become part of the in crowd, and in the in crowd they all believe something, they all say something, and you don't go out from that, and they sort of learn, we find out what it is we're supposed to think by watching these news channels, because everybody's on that line. And if you deviate from that, that's Russian talking points. Yeah, I
It's
know it's absurd. It's completely absurd, but that seems to be the way things are.
I mean, it's either that or they're playing some type of some type of game because maybe they know if they are recognizing the Russia's point of view right now that it would cause people to flip out in the establishment. So maybe they kind of have to move slowly,
Yeah.
and in tiny steps because we have seen a few things good come out from both Trump and Kellogg. Kellogg did denounce the assassination of General Igor Kurillo in Moscow. Maybe he's thinking like, well, we can't go assassinating generals. I'm
Yeah.
one of those.
Right. Yeah, well,
And
actually, even other U.S. government officials, when asked about it, they didn't really go out of their way to condemn it, but they say, will say, well, this is not something we really approve of. But they clearly are not going to pressure the Ukrainians. There's no sign of them doing that. But it's just they know that this clearly violates the norms of war. And they also understand there could be repercussions. If you get in the habit of assassinating leaders of the other side, hey, at some point the other side might start saying, well, tit for tat, and they don't want that, obviously. So
right.
it's in their interest to express some kind of disapproval. There's no question about it.
Right. So, well, at least we heard a little bit of that from General Kellogg saying that. And then Trump he said just these missile strikes were stupid.
Yeah.
So there is a little bit.
Right. I'm hopeful on that because, again, he actually, as I've said before, he has strong support within the Pentagon for his position. That's what the Pentagon clearly thought. And they fought it tooth and nail until finally, after Harris lost the election, Biden just threw caution to the winds and said, I'm just going to do what I'm going to do. I don't care what you guys say. And so there's no reason why he can't just end those. If he doesn't, then that's just, I think all hope is lost because that's something he clearly can do. He can end those strikes. He can do that right. He can de-escalate immediately. But the negotiations, that's for various reasons. I think those are not going to, even if they were, Kellogg really understood what was happening. And I don't believe that he does. I mean, he's just said too much. Sometimes you can see people will play a game, where they don't quite go out and say something openly when being interviewed by the mainstream media. But you kind of sense that they're hinting at something. They're being purposely ambiguous about something. There's nothing like that. He apparently, I didn't see this, but I've heard that he just went on and on and on about the North Koreans, which is one of the dumbest things of all. So,
Really?
Yeah, right. So, yeah, but again, even if they really knew what was going on in negotiations, I don't think can go anywhere. So my hope is just that, like we've said, it just could be educational. They could start to really understand that the Russians are serious, and maybe over time that'll lead to a reassessment of U.S. policy. But I don't think it'll be anything that we'll see. We won't see any results in the short term.
I wonder how that will go if you really believe that North Koreans are there. You believe that, Russia's been harmed incredibly and they're about to collapse economically. And then you go to the negotiating. Your mind is just going to turn to jelly, right? I mean, like, well, what's going on? Like,
I don't know. Yeah, it's like you blow circuits.
Yeah, that's why I do find it hard to believe that, somebody like General Kellogg would be so unaware. But the fact that he said he was going on about North Koreans, it's just like,
yeah.
It's playing a game, or they're just really ignorant.
I think they really believe it. I think they really do. And we've talked about this. It's just something that throughout the West, it's just ever since the unipolar moment, the West has really not been able to let go of that sense of invincibility, of superiority. And they haven't been able to let go of the idea of Russian feebleness and incompetence. And, that was, for them, that was a great time. They could just kick the Russians while they were down and they could do whatever they want. And the Russians might protest about something, but it didn't matter because they couldn't do anything. And it seems like they just can't let that go. For whatever reason, that's, they still inhabit that mental space. It's really bizarre, but
Is it part of just being old? Can't you're stubborn and well, I'm thinking part of it is more actually just the fact that some the formative years were all built when the USSR was there. The Soviet Union was that big rival. I think that just shaped so many people's
Yeah, but the
lives.
thing
But
is, yeah, but the thing is, actually, in those years, um, the we had respect for the Russians, for the Soviet Union. We feared them, and so that's why we didn't cross the red lines, and that's why um, we negotiated these treaties, that really took us back from the edge of the abyss. And it's just not true anymore. I think it was Alexander Mercouris was hoping that because Kellogg is old, he's 80 years old,
really,
that he would remember the Soviet Union and he would have this kind of this natural respect or whatever. But I just don't, maybe that'll come back. Maybe you'll realize that, oh, okay, we are again dealing with a real adversary. But at present time, you just don't see it.
I think maybe it's coupled with the fact that the Soviet Union, which they just equate to Russia as the adversary, and then when it collapsed, they just assume that they're now just completely weak, but they're still the adversary, and so there's this that hatred of Russia and the Soviet Union that I don't think I can never understand because I was born after it, so I just don't have any recollection of,
Well,
of the idea
the thing
that
is,
Russia is
actually,
bad.
I don't. Yeah, I don't. I don't remember anything like the hatred that we see now. Okay, there was fear, there was some hatred, but it was actually, I think, limited. I mean, there was a fair amount of respect for the Soviet Union, for their accomplishments, and for their cultural strengths and so forth. Yeah, people would denounce them, especially kind of on the anti-communist right. But by and large, like among intellectuals and so on, it wasn't. There were some who actually, um, were kind of advocates for them. Far left people who were communists. But in general, you didn't find that. They were opposed to the Soviet Union. They thought that it was necessary that we have a strong military to to oppose the Soviet threat, but they respected them. I just didn't. I don't recall anything of the hatred and the contempt that you see now. Nothing like that.
Is is this hatred? Do you think it's just all manufactured hatred? It's not organic. That this was something like I never really notice any hatred towards Russia when I was growing up as
Yeah.
a child or even in school. Really not until 2022. I felt like
Yeah.
maybe there. Well, I guess maybe starting with the Russia Gate, things started going
Oh yeah,
up and
most
stuff.
definitely
But
right. And I think you have to point out that Russiagate happened because there was already a propensity to hate Russia among within the establishment. Why did Hillary Clinton and her people want to pin this all on Russia? Because they already knew that was the boogeyman, and so they did it. Of course, yeah, it goes back. I mean, there was ever since really Putin began to kind of reestablish Russian sovereignty and began to chart an independent course, we can say. Under Yeltsin, Russia was just completely defeated and simply kind of was obeyed its master. And Putin steadily moved Russia away from that. So there was just growing. I remember in the early 2000s, there were more and more articles coming about what's going on in Russia. Actually things were getting better in Russia, but the Russians were becoming sovereign again. They were beginning to, develop some kind of self-respect and their economy was improving. They were getting a handle on the oligarchs and some aspects of corruption and so on and so forth. So that starting in the 2000s, I think there were always people, apparently like the reason Jeffrey Sachs talks about this. He was there in the 90s, and he said he was trying to get aid packages to Russia, the sort that he got for, let's say, example, in Poland. When he asked for it in Poland, it was within 24 hours he'd get it. But when he'd ask for it in Russia, they wouldn't. And it was later he found out it was just that there were people who did not want Russia, people in the U.S. government that did not want Russia to recover. They wanted, they saw this as a chance to kind of destroy Russia forever. And so there were always people like that. But I think, they were powerful people, but they were a minority. But then, like, starting in the 2000s, it became this, after Putin took power, there was this increasing hatred of Russia. It was fairly limited, but it expanded. And then, of course, it was, I think, in 2008 that he gave a speech. It made it clear. That was an important turning point, because that's when NATO declared that both Ukraine and Georgia would become members of NATO, right? And it has to be pointed out, I don't know what the percentage was in Georgia, but at that time in Ukraine, only 20% of the population wanted this. So this was something just that the elites decided. And even the Europeans back then, they were against this. Merkel, I think it was it Sarkozy back then? But the French president was also against it. But the Americans insisted, twisted arms, and it went through. And it was like, starting at that point, the Russians began to sort of ring the alarm bells and began to say, we're on a very dangerous course. And then, like, the more the Russians rang the alarm bells, the more they were demonized. And then we had 2014, the coup, and then the annexation of Crimea following the referendum there, and then so it began to, what was always there and had been growing began to really accelerate. 2008, 2014, and then 2016 with it was starting with the Russia hoax, and so. It's been there for a while. It's been growing, but it's just become very intense over the last, especially, I think, maybe since 2014, 2016.
Right. Well, why do you think there was this refusal to help Russia, with this aid package in the beginning? You mentioned they would give it to Poland right away, but when Russia, the idea was like, no, we got to keep Russia down. Instead of bringing Russia into the fold, like we're trying to bring everybody else in.
Yeah.
Like, Russia was open to joining NATO. I mean, just imagine how different the world would be. I don't think it's a good thing because, NATO seems to be an instrument of U.S. control.
Right. Well, I think maybe that's part of it. It's like, if Russia is such a big country, and even though Russia was clearly a mess at that time, and couldn't pose any kind of threat or really counter U.S. power in any meaningful way, they still understood its potential. And then if you brought it into NATO, it could become a real counter. It could counterbalance U.S. influence, and I think that's something they didn't want. I think that's basically it. There are some, let's say, ancestral hatreds. There, of course, certain Ukrainians, the ultra-nationalists, and some of those people are in the U.S. government. But more often, they're Jews, who's like Blinken, apparently, as his ancestors came from Ukraine, and they have a memory of the pogroms in Ukraine, or the Eastern or Western Russia rather, and that was a long time ago, but they haven't forgot. There's a sort of an ancestral hatred. That's part of it. I don't know how important that is, but that's there. But then the other thing, maybe which is more important, is the purely geopolitical one. It's just that Russia is destined always to be a major power, and we got to keep them out of Europe. That's the thinking of Western hegemonists.
So you can't bring them. We can't bring them in as a friend. They can't be part of they have to be an enemy. That was just this thinking. It just seems like such a stupid.
Right.
Trying to understand the source of this Russian hatred.
Yeah, well,
is
obviously, I think it's clear that they miscalculated. They just thought that they could destroy Russia, but Russia pulled itself together and it's become increasingly powerful. It's just growing in strength, economic strength, and military strength. Especially in the recent years, after the really overt attempts to destroy Russia, with the economic sanctions and then the proxy war. So this they were on that course. They just thought, I mean, that's the way these people think. We see it everywhere. Iran, in China, they're actually trying to, sanction certain sectors of the Chinese economy and companies like Huawei. In the end, they fail. It actually forces, it usually backfires because, okay, the Chinese, in this case, they're forced to, develop their own technologies, and they do it. And so then, you've actually lost the advantage that you had. There was a cooperative arrangement that was beneficial to both sides, and now you've lost that. But it seems to be, it's the thinking of a hegemon. It's just that we're always going to, we can't countenance a real rival, and we just got to bring him down. And it's what we've talked about, many times. It's the exact opposite of the multipolar thinking. Say that, okay, well, we can benefit. Let's see, this is just a reality. These powers are going to rise. We had our moment, but that was a historical accident. It was not etched in stone that it was going to be forever. And I think anybody, who's really has an understanding of history will see that. But these people don't see it that way. They see it as etched in stone. We are the hegemon, and we must. This is unacceptable that these other powers should rise, and we must keep them down.
Yeah, this unipolar moment that we had, do you think it was actually beneficial for the American people? Did we see a lot of benefits for being the number one guy on top, unchallenged for a while during this unipolar moment? Just the average American, did we see a big improvement and things get a lot better for us?
Well, it was a relatively prosperous decade. The '90s were. I don't know how much that was related to the unipolar moment. I mean, when you look at it, I think we benefited from opening trade relations with China, and China did too, right? They ended up taking over a lot of manufacturing and produced all kinds of very cheap goods that kept prices down in the U.S. No, but so that was, I mean, but that actually wasn't an aspect of the unipolar moment because that was cooperative. But it's where you find the expression of the unipolar moment really is like vis-a-vis the Middle East and Russia, even though it was just it was kind of more, it wasn't so visible. It was, again, certain elites that were making decisions to keep Russia down. But of course, our interventions in the Middle East proved disastrous. They did not help the American people at all. The Iraq War. Well, okay, there was first the Persian Gulf War. That really paved the way for the Iraq War. It just became it was an example of trying to solve every problem, not through diplomacy, but through military might. We decided that we could do this. This was really an important moment to us. Like in the past, we would have to worry about the Soviet Union, that if try to invade a country in there, which they considered important, they could, they might intervene directly or indirectly or invade another country, to kind of offset our gain or something like that. So we really stopped and think about it. But that time, hey, our hands are free. We're going to do this. We're going to attack, Iraq. And that was, I don't think really that had any consequences one way or the other for the U.S., economic consequence for the life of the average American. But what it is, it put us on that road to future disasters, like the Iraq War after 9/11, which clearly, was very costly. In the end, there are different estimates, but we probably are talking about trillions of dollars. It did not. And if you sent everybody a bill for what that costs, I think like the average family, I can't remember what it is, but we're talking about tens of thousands of dollars. It did nothing to benefit the average American.
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds like maybe back during the times during the Cold War, time of the Soviet Union and the United States were playing kind of a game of Risk where you're putting different pieces on the map and everybody's looking at the world map, and we got these two powers and you got to make sure that they're in balance and in check. And then with the collapse of the Soviet Union, basically one player exited the game. And
Yeah.
then the U.S. is like, great, now we can just move our pieces all over the board.
Right.
And now Russia's come back, and we're like, well, we got to keep on putting. And Russia's like, we're not even playing this game. Stop. We're playing solitaire over here. Everybody's playing
Yeah.
solitaire, and the U.S.
Yeah.
is trying to play Risk while everybody's playing their own a different game. It's almost
Yeah.
like that's what's happening. And so we
Yeah.
have that mindset that we got to win the game of Risk when the world's not playing that game anymore. But we're still thinking that we have to play that game, and we gotta capture all the places on the board. Do you think that's a good analogy?
I think that's a fair analogy. I think that works.
Okay, good. I was just needed that approval from you, Dad. Let me take it back to some recent events that happened. So just in the past 2 days, just since our last episode, there have been two more attacks from Ukraine into Russia. One was using 6 ATACMS and 4 Storm Shadows, from what I gather, that struck into the Rostov Oblast. I think it hit a chemical plant. The attack was on a chemical plant with a bunch of drones. Can you tell me a little bit about that attack and
Okay.
your thoughts on it?
Yeah, well, my understanding is that all 6 ATACMS were brought down. 3 of the 4 Storm Shadows were, and the fourth one veered off course, maybe because of electronic warfare, though that wasn't stated, and did some minor damage to, I think, an administration building there. So again, you'd have to say it's a failure of an attack. And again, the Russians have demonstrated the potency of their air defense system, and the ATACMS and the Storm Shadows have been shown to be really very ineffective weapons, at least against the Russians. But the Russians, the Ministry of Defense, confirmed this attack and said there would be retaliation. And then a strike was carried out, I think a day or two ago, shortly thereafter.
Or this morning, wasn't it? Or maybe it was.
I think it was a little bit. I think maybe it was the Ministry of Defense came out. Yeah, maybe it was yesterday. Not too long ago. It was not too long after the attack occurred, in the recent past. Okay, and that so-called retaliation consisted of a strike on, I think it's what you call an SBU. That's intelligence. Sort of like the equivalent of the CIA in...
Or GRU for
I don't
Russia.
think that's GUR, actually.
GR, sorry.
But it wasn't GRU. They have two. The GUR is the... you think of GRU because in Russia it's called the GRU. But in Ukraine it's GUR, and it's the military intelligence. But then there is kind of the General Intelligence Agency, and that is, I believe it's the SBU. There was a command center of the SBU that was struck. And then there was a missile design and production company, and it was struck. And at least according to one report, this had been struck in the past, but this time they struck the headquarters, at least according to one report that I saw. And then some Patriot system was also struck in Kiev. These were all in Kiev or right outside of Kiev. So, I was looking at that. That might be a legitimate retaliation because we talked about decision-making centers. So, if they got this intelligence command center and the headquarters of this missile institute, I think, you could call it sort of it's not a very... let's say, intense retaliation or a very obvious one, but it does seem to have it does appear to be an actual retaliation. Because I think you could fairly call those decision-making centers. They're probably fairly low level, but I think that, again, for the reasons that we've talked about, I think that Putin wants to go up this, if he's forced to go up this escalation ladder, he wants to go up very slowly. And so this seems like just one rung or half a rung or something up the escalation ladder.
It's just it's amazing looking at comparing these two attacks. What the U.S. and Ukraine put together, nothing happens, and this has happened again and again and again. Every time they do these attack and Storm Shadow volleys, largely ineffective. Occasionally they get lucky and, may kill a few people from a missile that gets knocked off course or something like this. But then you see Russia's retaliation, and with the U.S. the air defense systems, everything are concentrated in Kiev. They're able to they're able to destroy an air defense system, a Patriot system that costs over $1 billion. They're able to hit a command center that should be very well protected and hidden. And they did this quickly after retaliation. It's like, okay, you hit us. It didn't work. You guys, it failed your attack, but we told you you can't do this, so now we have to retaliate. And then their attack is just so effective. Just comparing these two attacks side by side, it's unbelievable that we are continuing to try to do this. To me, it just looks so pathetic from the U.S. point of view. And I think a lot of people around the world have to be seeing that and being like, man, this is making the U.S. look really weak and really incompetent.
I think it's probably fair to say, or it needs to be said, that at least one of the missiles appears to have been brought down by Ukrainian air defense. And the Russians fired Iskander missiles, which are a cruise missile, if I'm remembering correctly. And then, I hope I'm right about it. I'm not sure, actually. I should double check on that. but then Kinjal, those are the hypersonics. Okay. Now, the Kinjals are just basically impossible, or very, very difficult. I think they actually had some kind of, I saw the statistic recently, is that if they fired something like 20, or, it was a large number, a dozen or something, missiles against one Kinjal, they had a 25% chance of bringing it down. But just like to fire 25 Patriot missiles, we're talking about $100 million to have a 25% chance of taking it down. The Kinjal, it should be remembered, when it approaches its target, actually goes to drops below hypersonic speed. It's still going very fast. I think it's just a little bit below hypersonic speed. It's not like the Oreshnik that actually strikes at well above hypersonic speed. So there's a small chance you might get it. Now, the Ukrainians didn't even claim that they had taken down any of the Kinjals. I don't know how many were fired. They claimed that they actually intercepted all of the Iskanders. But clearly it's not true. I mean, there's video footage out there of all kinds of explosions. And they may have gotten one, they may have gotten two. But again, as you pointed out, Kiev is actually their best defended. It's like the only place where they have any sort of considerable air defense. And I think that's why the Russians chose to use the Kinjal, because they knew that they needed their top of the line stuff to be sure that they would get through.
Right. We got to point out that where Ukraine has been attacking is just into very remote regions. They've done some into Kursk, some into Rostov. Rostov. Right. It's like, and Russia has a huge airspace to cover, so they're doing much better. It's not like they're firing into Moscow where it's got to be super.
Exactly. They're looking for some kind of weakness somewhere and trying to exploit it. And yet they fail to do so. And we're talking about a vast territory. You're right. Right. And still they can't do it.
Right. It's impressive. And you told me that basically what the Russians do is they develop what they call a profile of a weapon. It takes them maybe about 2 weeks usually to build a profile for a weapon and essentially neutralize it. I'm just wondering, why do you think there has been no really ability on the U.S. side to build profiles against against Russian weapons? Like the Iskander sounds like it's something that is maybe comparable to an ATACMS. It's a cruise missile, right? It's not.
Well, the ATACMS is not a cruise missile. It's a ballistic missile. Yeah.
Okay.
The Storm Shadow is a cruise. The Storm Shadow is a cruise missile.
Okay, so maybe the Storm Shadow and the Iskander are kind of comparable. I'm not a military guy. I don't know, but
actually, I'm not quite. I have to double check on whether the Iskander is a ballistic or cruise. Right now, it slips my mind. It could be ballistic, actually, but it doesn't really matter. It's sort of. I think it is comparable either to the ATACMS or to the Storm Shadow, and the Russians have shown the ability to neutralize both of those. The question is, why can't the Americans do the same? And apparently the Russians have a huge lead in air defense, and this goes way back to the Soviet times. I think it was like way back in the 80s, 70s. I think 70s, maybe even earlier, that the Russians looked at the growing air power of NATO and really which is really the U.S. and they felt like they couldn't really counter it directly. That they just didn't have the resources to develop an air force that was the equal of what the Americans were putting together. So they decided to invest heavily in air defense. And so going way back then, that's, like over time, the S-200, the S-300. The S-300, that was developed during the Soviet years, but it's still actually a very effective air defense system. There's still plenty out there. And that's what the Ukrainians started the war with. They had their S-300 systems. The whole country was pretty much covered. And so that was one reason that they did well initially. It took a while for the Russians to actually pick apart that system. What they did is they went after the energy system and forced the Ukrainians to fire a lot of S-300 missiles to protect the energy system. And eventually they used up their entire stock. So, it was a combination of just forcing them to use up these missiles and then also actually striking the actual launchers. So now they're just pretty much gone. But they were an effective defense. I mean, again, this is something that was developed, we're talking like 30 years ago, but it's good. And
Or
now,
in the
of course,
70s, 50 years ago, you mean?
yeah, the Russians have gone beyond that. They have now S-400s, S-500s, and the Americans do not have anything comparable. I mean, they have. I'll give you one example. They have the THAAD, and I think that's actually good for what it's supposed to do, and that is it's a high altitude anti-ballistic missile system. So it's if you're firing a high altitude ballistic missile, you use the THAAD, and it's pretty good at bringing down that kind of missile. But like the S-400 has that capability, and it has a wide range of other capabilities. So it can shoot down all kinds, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles coming in at different trajectories, whether it's low altitude or high altitude. It can deal with a whole range of missiles. And then we have the THAAD. Again, it's good, but has a very narrow application. So you maybe okay, they got the THAAD, we'll just use this missile instead, because it can't do anything against that. And then like the S-500 apparently can actually take down satellites too. I mean, it actually can. So it extends into space. So there's just nothing comparable on the U.S. side. We just haven't made those investments. We took a different course, going way back, that we would build up this air fleet, and and I think that that's proving to be a mistake. It's just like in the new age, the missiles and air defense systems. Missiles are much more potent than actually aircraft are. I think I was hearing this from, it was Ted, maybe it was Ted Postel or maybe it was somebody else, but some military expert. And so this person had actually been speaking to pilots and it said, yeah, like, way back, I remember back in the 80s or the 90s, the enemy could fire an anti-aircraft missile at you. And it was scary. You had to immediately take evasive action. And these were heat-seeking missiles, but you could, by taking evasive action immediately, if you knew what you're doing, you were an experienced pilot, you could escape it. It was a terrifying minute or something, or half a minute, but you could be confident that you would survive that attack. And it's just not true anymore. That these missiles are just too fast, too accurate. And when it gets fired at you, you're gone. So it seems like I think the U.S. made a huge, probably multi-trillion-dollar mistake going down this road. With the F-35s, these hugely expensive. I think on the average they're $110 million per aircraft. And they are used, like we saw in the case of Iran. This is what we've heard. I believe it's true. It hasn't been confirmed, but it appears to be true that the F-35s were approaching. Maybe they were able to go over Iraqi airspace, but as they approached Iran, they became aware that they had been detected by Iranian radar, and they just had to turn around, even though they're supposed to be have stealth capabilities. they still couldn't fool the air defense system that Iran has, which is at least in part Russian. I mean, we don't want to give the Iranians short shrift. I think clearly they've shown some remarkable technological capabilities, but they also are drawing on Russian experience and Russian equipment.
Yeah, it seems like what you're saying is essentially that the Air Force is kind of going the way of the Navy, at least the traditional Air Force in terms of using aircraft. Right now the Navy, we pour a lot of money into these aircraft carriers, but they're really obsolete in this day and age. But we keep on
I think so.
pouring a lot of money.
Yeah.
But yeah, we know that these hypersonic missiles can just take them down and nothing can stop them. There's the ducks. But you're kind of saying it's the same thing actually with our Air Force. If you're going up against a country that has Russian level air defense, then they're pretty worthless, right?
Yeah, right. They're great. Well, you can see like the Israelis just have been bombing Lebanon and Gaza mercilessly, and they're doing that with aircraft because there's no air defense to speak of in those countries. So they're just completely vulnerable, and they can just go fly over these places and drop their 2,000-pound bombs and take out entire city blocks, and that's what they do. But against a peer or near peer adversary, they're just not worth very much. I mean, you can see even with the Russians are still careful. I think it's just for this reason. I think they very rarely fly directly over Ukrainian airspace. I think in some places they now can because they've so degraded the air defense system of the Ukrainians. But in general, they're using those aircraft as launch platforms for the guided bombs. They can drop those 10, 20 kilometers away and hit a target on the front line. And then also to fire missiles. There are various missiles that are air launched. So in these strikes, some are sea launched, some are ground launched, and some are air launched. And I guess the air launched missiles have the advantage of high speed at the moment of launch. So they're launched at Mach 3 or Mach 5 or something like that, and so they come in even quicker than the other ones. So they do serve a purpose, but even the Russians, in spite of the greatly degraded air defense, in general they don't fly over Ukraine. Because you just understand that even if they don't have very much, it just takes one missile, and these missiles just are now, again, they're fast enough and accurate enough that they really can take down any aircraft.
Right. And that's why we never hear anything about the F-16s. It's just because they'll get shot down if they try to do anything, right?
Right. The idea was that they were going to be used back in Western Ukraine as air defense. You would. So they would go up, they would stay a long ways from the front line, but if, let's say, there are incoming missiles, they could be used to fire some air defense missiles. And there's some claims that I think like in the most recent, the massive strike, the Ukrainians claim that their F-16s took down a whole bunch of it, but there's no evidence. And in fact, it seems like the West didn't even bother to report it. Nobody really believes it. They seem to be completely out of the picture. And again, it's just another one of these things. It's just sort of silly. Every time there's this huge, there are these cries, give them F-16s, or take the restrictions off the ATACMS. And before that, it was just give them ATACMS. And it was just, there was this certainty that that this would actually be the game changer. This would turn the tide. And it never happens. It's just, you would think it would start to penetrate the skulls of these people, but they just go to the next wonder weapon.
Right. That I always ask that question, like, why are we doing this? Why do they keep on trying? And especially after these ATACMS strikes and everything gets shot down, clearly they understand what's happening, right? That Russia has very formidable air defense, and it's far superior to what we have.
Right.
And they
right.
Are they acting surprised? Like, oh, what? It didn't work.
Well, they don't even talk about it. That's the thing. It just doesn't get reported. I have no doubt that the Pentagon is looking at this and saying, damn, And I think that's one of the main reasons they were against this in the first place. They just knew it wasn't going to be effective. But the politicians just don't listen to them. The politicians are just so high on Western hegemony that they just can't believe it. And
it must be a pretty damn good high if they've been high for this long.
Be, right. Right.
So maybe we just don't understand what they're what's going through them right now. But it seems like that after we had kind of an initial lull after the Oreshnik was first used, it seems like things are starting to heat up again. It seems like we are seeing the West, NATO, increase these ineffective strikes into Russia. We're seeing more and more of it. What do you think is the plan here? I've been hearing rumors that they're going to try to do something big before Trump comes into office. There's rumors of potentially Ukraine invading Bryansk region, which just sounds insane after the Kursk debacle. Would you really want to try to do this?
Yeah.
And then I've heard rumors that the Ukrainians may try to blow up the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. What are your thoughts? Where do you see this going now?
Yeah, well, that's certainly, those are all possibilities. I think there's no question about it. I mean, it seems Zelensky and his fellow regime leaders seem to understand that the only way they can win this war is to bring in NATO on their side. I mean, and that's what he seems to be, as far as you can see, some kind of rational plan behind the things that he's doing and saying. I think that's it. So again, he had his victory plan, which was, as Viktor Orban put it, a World War III plan. It just seemed like it was designed to bring in NATO on the side of Ukraine, to bringing them in directly. And I think that's what, as far as Ukraine is concerned, that's what they're trying to do. They're really anything they can do to, possibly, like in the case of a nuclear power plant, they would attempt some kind of false flag. I think it would be obscenely obvious that it was a false flag, but it just seems like the Western media just simply, basically, does not question anything that the Ukrainians feed them. It all seems desperate, and I don't see how any of it's going to work. They clearly are desperate.
Right. But do you think that what we're seeing right now, a pattern of increased escalation, accelerating, is that what you're seeing? That this is the plan of the Biden administration to just what do you think is the plan? Like I've always say, these attacks seem like escalation for the sake of escalation, to try to goad Russia into doing something, to try to bring NATO in, to create some type of calamity, disaster. Is that the goal right now?
I don't know. Again, I'll make the point that I made before. To the extent that there is a plan, that's probably it. What you've described there. But I'm not even sure that they really have a plan. It just doesn't. If you look at it, nothing has worked. There's just no reason to think this is going to work. They're just throwing stuff at the Russians. It's just like they just can't believe that the Russians are actually strong and that they're losing this war. And I just don't seem like they really can get their minds wrapped around that. And so I say, well, the only problem is that we haven't, we've been showing too much restraint. So let's just take the gloves off. Let's just start, crossing red lines and so on and so forth.
When we took the gloves off, and it looks like we don't even have fists, just little nubs,
Right. And I think they actually had warnings from the Pentagon, but they just can't believe it. Again, it's irrational. I've offered the best explanations I can, but that's
inadequate.
Yeah.
No, it's just mind-boggling to me just how self-destructive the moves we make are. Just they backfire. The economic sanctions, these to weaken Russia, strengthen Russia. Everything we've done is just hurting us and hurting Europe more than anybody.
Hurting Europe more than the U.S. Yeah,
right.
No question about it.
Of course, Ukraine the most. Just what Ukraine's gone through is just horrific. I saw some more videos yesterday of them, of these press gangs. scary soldiers, and just thinking that they saw them pulling over, they just stopped a car on the street, and the guy
Yeah.
wouldn't open the door, and they tried to spray gas in there and light it on fire to flame them out. It's just crazy. Like, this is what we're
Yeah.
supporting. These people
Right.
don't want to fight. It's just
Yeah. Yeah,
they're
no,
running out
it's
of men.
horrifying. It really is horrifying. And yeah, that's right. What kind of regime is this? What kind of regime is the West supporting? It's just, but yeah, that's some just very, vivid visual evidence. And it's there every day. I mean, it's just not like there was one, two or three videos. It's just they come out like two or three a day, and they've been coming out for better than a year. We're talking about thousands of these videos. I've seen more than I can. It's actually very hard to watch. It really
Yeah,
is.
no,
So I generally don't watch them, but it just every once in a while I feel like I should. It's saying, what a nightmare. What a nightmare.
Right. And for those people, it's just got to be so scary for them because they know they just get sent to the front, and they'll either get blown up by the Russians, or if they try to flee, they'll get killed by their own people, or if they're lucky, they can surrender and and be taken. That's the best case scenario for them. I feel like, is if they can surrender quickly and go over to the Russian side. But it's just so pointless. They got to feel like, what's the point of doing this? We're just to extend this for what? For how long?
Yeah,
like,
right.
that's what I think is becoming indefensible for the West. It's at one point, it's like, well, they keep on running out of men, lower the conscription age, let's get women in there. And at some point, you're just like, this is wrong, right? Shouldn't we listen to the save as many people as we can in Ukraine? Maybe we should hold an election. What do the Ukrainians want? Maybe we should talk to them. Who are we to tell Ukraine, you have to lower your conscription age? You have to start throwing teenagers into the front line now.
Right.
It's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, well, this is, you can say it all stems from a refusal to face reality. It's the reality of what's happening on the front lines. It's the reality of what Russia has become. And, they're still inhabiting this imaginary world. And it's the thing, it's like in your imaginary world, you're the good guys and you have the white hats. But because of your refusal to look at reality, you're actually, creating this nightmare in reality. You have your dream, but this is what happens. It's important for people to stop and think what is real, and then to act soberly and understand that, okay, maybe we can't achieve all our ideals or make all our dreams come true. We just have to deal with the reality. But you don't find that sober approach anywhere in the West, with the exception of Viktor Orban and Fico and, a couple other, and some dissident politicians. But, by and large, the leadership is entirely in the grips of this delusion.
I think we're going to stay in this grips of this delusion until what? Until
it seems like there's again because I make a point of just at least reading the headlines from the mainstream news, and they're just, I don't see really any evidence that the establishment in the West is waking up. They're just doubling down. At some point, they have to I don't know what it'll be. It's like the fall of Kiev or the fall of Odessa or the Russians going all the way to the Dnieper. And that could actually happen pretty soon because, what's happening there in the southern Donbass is that the Russians are punching through the last real fortifications. Again, over the course, ever since 2014, the Ukrainians have created really just really dense fortifications everywhere from the front line all the way back to these logistics hubs, which the Russians are now in the process of taking. We're talking about Kurillo, Selidovo, which they've already taken, and Pokrovsk, right?
Yeah, Pokrovsk, I think.
Yeah, Pokrovsk, yeah. And they're going to, the two or the three are basically taken already, and then the siege of Pokrovsk has begun. and that'll be that. And the thing is, after those logistic hubs, which were kind of the back of the entire defense system that the Ukrainians created over the course of a good 8 years or so, there's really nothing. There just isn't. There are no fortifications, and that's true all the way to the Dnieper. And I think that what we're going to see, as they're punching through the last of them, there's just going to be I guess it's not going to be lightning speed. We just in this day and age we can't do blitzkrieg. They have to move their like electronic warfare kind of bubble with the frontline units, and they got to make sure that they have logistic chains very properly established. So it won't be a blitzkrieg, but it should go. I think it's going to go quite a bit faster, and we're really very close to that point right now. And so sometime next year we'll see that, and we'll see them march all the way to the Dnieper. And maybe at that point you'll start to get some sort of change in the narrative in the West. And we'll see. Again, it's like what I've said many times. It's hard to predict the behavior of a crazy man, and that's what the West is. It's deluded. And if this delusion, this bubble that it inhabits is popped, what are they going to do? I don't really know. We'll see.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll have lots to talk about, I feel like, next year. I think things will get a lot crazier before they get better.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt about it. That's the one forecast that I think is entirely reliable. Things will keep on getting crazier.
Yeah. Okay, well, hope everybody stays safe out there. All right, Dad, I guess we'll end it there. Thanks for the discussion. Have a good day and rest of the weekend.
Yeah, you too.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.